Cuban Revolution, 1953 to 1959, was a pivotal event in the 20th century, not just for Cuba, but for global geopolitics, ideology, and social movements. The overthrow of the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista and the rise of Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and their revolutionary government reshaped the political landscape of Latin America and beyond. The revolution was not just a local event, but a global phenomenon that influenced the Cold War, inspired liberation movements, and highlighted the tensions between imperialism and national sovereignty. Origins of the Cuban Revolution. Cuba in the early 20th century was heavily influenced by the United States. Following its independence from Spain in 1898, the U.S. retained significant control over Cuban affairs, especially through the Platt Amendment, which allowed for U.S. intervention in Cuban politics. By the 1950s, U.S. corporations dominated much of Cuba's economy, owning vast tracts of agricultural land, utilities, and industries. Batista's regime, marked by corruption, repression, and inequality, catered to these foreign interests at the expense of the Cuban people. Cuban society was characterized by stark disparities. The rural population, in particular, faced extreme poverty, with limited access to education, healthcare, and land. This created fertile ground for revolutionary movements, including Castro's July 26 movement, which sought to overthrow Batista and establish a government that prioritized the needs of ordinary Cubans. Key events of the revolution. The Cuban Revolution officially began on July 26, 1953, when Fidel Castro and a group of revolutionaries attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The attack failed, and Castro was captured and imprisoned. However, the trial that followed allowed him to deliver his famous speech, "History Will Absolve Me," which outlined his vision for a new Cuba. After being released under a general amnesty, Castro regrouped in Mexico, where he met Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor turned revolutionary. Together they launched the Granma expedition in 1956, landing in eastern Cuba and beginning a guerrilla war against Batista's forces. Over the next 2 years, the revolutionaries gained popular support, particularly among the rural poor, while Batista's regime grew increasingly isolated and discredited. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and the revolutionaries entered Havana to widespread acclaim. Domestic reforms. The revolutionary government implemented sweeping reforms aimed at addressing Cuba's social and economic inequalities. These included land redistribution, nationalization of industries, and the establishment of universal healthcare and education systems. The government also launched literacy campaigns and healthcare initiatives that dramatically improved living standards for the majority of Cubans. However, these reforms came at a cost. Many members of the upper and middle classes, whose properties and businesses were confiscated, fled to the United States. Political dissent was suppressed, and opposition parties were banned. Over time, the Cuban government aligned itself with the Soviet Union, adopting a one-party socialist model that limited political freedoms. Global impact of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution had profound global implications, influencing both the Cold War and decolonization movements across the world. The Cold War context. Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union placed it at the center of Cold War tensions. The United States, alarmed by the establishment of a socialist state just 90 miles from its shores, imposed an economic embargo on Cuba in 1960 and supported the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. These actions pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The crisis ended with the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba and U.S. missiles from Turkey, but it solidified Cuba's role as a key player in the global ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism. Inspiration for liberation movements. The Cuban Revolution served as an inspiration for anti-colonial and liberation movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Che Guevara, in particular, became a symbol of revolutionary struggle worldwide. After leaving Cuba, he attempted to foment revolutions in Congo and Bolivia, where he was captured and executed in 1967. Despite his death, Guevara's image and ideas continued to inspire leftist movements. In Latin America, the Cuban model of armed struggle influenced guerrilla movements in countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Colombia. The Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, 1979, drew heavily from the Cuban experience, as did various Marxist insurgencies throughout the region. Support for African liberation. Cuba's commitment to anti-imperialism extended to Africa, where it supported liberation movements and anti-apartheid. Support for African liberation. Cuba's commitment to anti-imperialism extended to Africa, where it supported liberation movements and anti-apartheid struggles. Cuban troops played a decisive role in the Angolan Civil War, particularly in the Battle of Quito Cuanavale, 1987 to 1988, which significantly weakened South Africa's apartheid regime and accelerated the independence of Namibia. This solidarity earned Cuba respect among many African nations and underscored its role as a champion of third world causes. Cultural and intellectual influence. The Cuban Revolution also had a significant cultural and intellectual impact. It inspired debates about development, imperialism, and socialism among scholars, artists, and activists worldwide. Revolution's successes in healthcare and education were often cited as evidence of the potential benefits of socialist policies, even by critics of the Cuban government. In literature and art, the revolution became a symbol of resistance against oppression. Writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a close friend of Fidel Castro, celebrated its ideals, while its imagery became iconic in global popular culture. Criticisms and challenges. Despite its achievements, the Cuban Revolution has been the subject of significant criticism. Its suppression of political dissent and lack of democratic institutions have drawn condemnation from human rights organizations and Western governments. The economic model it adopted, heavily reliant on Soviet aid, proved unsustainable after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, leading to a severe economic crisis known as the Special Period. Moreover, Cuba's role in exporting revolution was controversial. While it inspired many, it also provoked U.S. intervention and contributed to prolonged conflicts in countries like Angola and Nicaragua. The Cuban government's tight control over its citizens and limited freedoms also alienated some of its former supporters. Legacy and contemporary relevance. The Cuban Revolution remains a defining moment in modern history. For many, it symbolizes the possibility of resistance against imperialism and the fight for social justice. Cuba's healthcare and education systems continue to be admired, particularly in the global south, where Cuban doctors and teachers have provided assistance in dozens of countries. At the same time, the revolution's limitations highlight the challenges of building a socialist society in the face of external pressure and internal contradictions. The ongoing U.S. embargo, combined with Cuba's own economic mismanagement, has kept the country in a state of relative isolation and underdevelopment. In recent years, Cuba has faced new challenges, including the transition to a post-Castro leadership, economic reforms, and growing demands for political change. The death of Fidel Castro in 2016 marked the end of an era, but the ideals and contradictions of the revolution continue to shape Cuba's identity and global image. The Cuban Revolution was not just a transformative event for Cuba, but a global phenomenon with far-reaching consequences. It challenged the dominance of the United States in Latin America, inspired liberation movements worldwide, and became a symbol of resistance against imperialism and inequality. While its legacy is contested, the revolution remains a powerful reminder of the complexities of social change and the enduring struggle for a more just world. Its impact, both positive and negative, continues to be felt, making it a subject of enduring relevance and debate in global history.